Yay! We are so excited for our conversation on enterprise selling, people in the process to make it happen. We've got Gabriella here today. While we wait for folks to come in, I want to know where you went for summer vacation, Gabriella. Like, I know that, summer vacation got thrown for a loop, but did you do anything fun?
Yeah, I have to think about that. Well, I I've had a lot of good friends move to New York recently, so I went out to New York to go visit them. Also,
Yay.
I'm from the East Coast, kind of. I'm like Michigan slash have lots of family in DC. So I live in the Bay Area actually. So going out to the East Coast is actually very nice for me because I find it fun, different change up of pace, but also have a ton of family and friends out there. So that was, I guess, my big thing. We did do a fun offsite for the team actually. So we did a mix. We did a mix of Tahoe and also outside of Tahoe because we started it and then unfortunately the Tahoe smoke came right in the middle of it. So we decided let's make a pivot and then we went straight to Monterey and ended up having an amazing time. So that was pretty fun because I was with the full team and everyone getting together in person and everything. So
Amazing. Did you go to the aquarium? I used to be a member at the Monterey Bay
so
Aquarium.
we did not, but we did something very close to that. We actually did a really cool kayaking tour where we saw lots of otters and all these other things. So it was actually pretty cool because we were pretty close to a lot of the animals. A lot of the sea lions were kind of swimming around us. So it was a pretty cool experience.
That's awesome. And I'm in Brooklyn, so next time you come out, we got to hang out.
Yeah, for
Be
sure.
here. Well, welcome everyone. I'm going to pop to the next screen here. This event is hosted by the team at Modern Sales Pros. We're so excited to dive in. We won't be talking about anything nearly as fun as swimming with sea lions, but I think it's pretty interesting still. So for those of you not familiar, Modern Sales Pros, or MSP as we like to call it, is one of the world's largest revenue leadership communities for those in sales management, sales and rev ops, all the supporting disciplines. And our mission is to create an environment for our many, many growing members to answer questions they might otherwise struggle to answer on their own. We do that through awesome live events like the one you're at here today, through our really cool forum, and hopefully soon in-person events. But we're excited to all have you here today. And if you are not a member, we are going to force you to be one afterwards, but you're going to love it. It's going to be great. So enough about Modern Sales Pros. This session is sponsored by Prelay, and this would not be possible without them. I'm going to pass it over to Gabriella to say a few words about Prelay.
Yeah, happy to. Yeah, for everyone listening here right now, Prelay is a team selling platform. We allow for teams to be able to easily coordinate and communicate on the deal, even more the most complex deals you might have, those enterprise and kind of sticky strategic ones as well. So we really provide one platform and integrations with plenty of others to make sure that all reps, all team members like SEs, proposal managers, you name it, whoever has to get involved is able to stay aligned throughout even a long, lengthy deal.
Beautiful, beautiful. Since we're already here, I'm going to have you introduce yourself as our guest of honor, our speaker today. Give us a little bit of info on you, aside from the sea lions, which I cannot get over. That sounds amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am the CEO and co-founder of Prelay. Started it based upon a lot of my experience scaling out fast growth go-to-market teams. Overall, we were scaling around those complex deals I'm talking about right now that tend to last months and sometimes years at a time, and you're having to work far beyond just one person to get that done. So started that some time back, and now work with companies globally around how do they start to scale out a lot of their people around their processes, especially as they're maybe scaling very fast themselves, changing up product lines, business lines, you name it, across the board. So love what I do and excited to share a little bit more today.
Awesome. We're so excited to have you here. Before we dive into our conversation, I'm going to go over some quick housekeeping notes for everyone. So first off, before we all ask, yes, this session is being recorded. You're all going to get it in an email after this, but you can also check it out on our MSP website. Second, we love questions. We love this to be really interactive. If you have something you'd like to ask, please do use our little Q&A function. We would love to answer all of your questions. This is what we're going to be talking about today, our agenda here. We're going to be talking about the first principles of enterprise selling. It's Halloween, so we're going to be talking about horror stories as well, and then universal fixes for all those problems that we're seeing in our horror stories, and then how to identify and fix the problems in our processes. So you ready to dive in?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay, let's do it. Okay, so we know that enterprise selling, it's long, it's complex, it's such a process. What are the first principles of enterprise selling that you've seen, that you've identified, that you'd love to share with us?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I guess to take a step back is like enterprises are massive, right? Like when I talk about the complex deals and plenty of people having to hop in, it's when you think about kind of maybe rock climbing or something. With this, it's you're climbing up a mountain. It's not any hill like SMB. It's a huge mountain that takes a lot of time. There's a lot of obstacles in the way. And oftentimes, not only is it just you climbing that mountain, it's actually competition alongside. It could be the status quo that is, certainly pretty impressive. They maybe built something out, but there's always kind of that build versus buy play where potentially they could also be taking a look at a competitor and really thinking through how does this competitor compare to this vendor. That's really where we find that you have to prove you're enough. We find that especially in this day and age of so much more technology coming in this space, as you can imagine, I feel like the past 10 years, it's been compounding. And even in this past year, it has been, especially with COVID and hybrid work and kind of the technology that needs to be in place now, that we find that it's just becoming so much harder to become that market leader, to become really digging into kind of the enterprise space and really making a footprint there. So really proving you're enough is a huge principle. Is how do I make sure I prove out, whether it's from key validation points of proving out that maybe my product's enough from a proof of concept. I have to maybe build out net new pieces around the process. Maybe it's more on the trial end of going through kind of proving out that functionality throughout the process as well. Potentially, it could be just from a business perspective of, hey, I need to prove out the legitimacy of my business and go through key proposals, security, whatever it might be to get this across the line. Additionally, it could be kind of that kind of pilot period where you're going through more of an experiential process. You're potentially going through and proving out, hey, our services are top notch, as well as also our core product is top notch as well. So that certainly there's a lot of core pieces that buyers really have to dig into when they're evaluating against a competitor, against a status quo. That each individual vendor does need to prove they're enough in each one of those kind of, validation points as well. And when we think about, those core validation points, I think a huge portion of that is how do I run just a succinct process? Because when you're going through these validation points I just mentioned, those, POCs, those trials, those potential pilot periods, business kind of cases that you have to run through, those are all things that inherently take a lot of time and a lot of people as well. When you think of potentially in a POC, right, you might have some particular, maybe technical validation you have to run through, or solution design work where you're building out that product for that team. That's really where it goes far beyond just a rep. You bring in the SE potentially for that business related item. You're bringing in the proposal manager. You're bringing in deal desk potentially. And in the end, how do you run a succinct process around that? So really a huge portion of like first principles is how do I make sure that we're running a succinct process, not for us only internally to kind of clean up what's happening internally with all of the different stakeholders that have to get involved, the full process that needs to be run. Typically, honestly, we find that a lot of this is run on docs and sheets to date and pretty ad hoc. So really thinking through that process is a huge portion of how you can get these deals across the line thoughtfully, especially in an enterprise sense, because you will need to prove out what value does this drive, and the value could be from all of those kind of different validation points I did mention. Because I think typically, especially for these enterprise accounts, they have certainly, it's not their first go around of purchasing software. They've certainly purchased it, whether or not it's in that department and multiple other departments. So they always have a process they like to run. And certainly they're always looking for very clear value and ROI, especially as many times a lot of these enterprises are maybe pushing toward IPO. they're pushing toward their next funding round, and have a very thoughtful process of gathering budget, as well as also figuring out how these systems work together internally as well. So really, I think driving toward that success of the deal, those activities do need to be involved, and reps, far beyond reps, there's kind of a lot of other people that have to be aligned there. So when we think about the overall enterprise sale, it goes back to team selling. It's how do we make sure we're running different process sets, and there could be multiple, like I mentioned, those POCs, the proposal management ends of things where there's multiple people hopping in. How do you really pair people and process with that? How are we thinking through that, how people should be hopping into that? Now, certainly in Salesforce, maybe we're trying to document key sales stages and that we want just at least people involved in each one. But what is the time period of that? When are the deliverables due by? When are we getting these deliverables done? And also, how is this really pairing with the buyer experience? How are we thinking through how these different people in the org might need to help out with buyer requests and deliverables that need to go on to get this deal across the line, especially if you're in a competitive scenario? So that's really where it brings me to really pairing people and process. And I think not enough people and companies do this and really think through that. I always get the question, I think I've gotten it maybe 4 or 5 times this week of, what is the biggest problem to be solving in this space right now? Is it the people side, where it's ensuring that you can resource the right people on the deal? Or is it the process side of how do I ensure that I can run the most thoughtful process that's going to drive value for the buyer or customer? And I always say it's both. It's a symptom of both things. I always think in my background's in athletics, and I always think in athletic terms of people always kind of would say, oh, my hamstring hurts. And you'd be like, oh, your hamstring hurts, then your quad is probably pretty sore then. So that means that in the end, if your people processes are off, your process is probably off most likely. And that's a symptom of really the process being off, is because you don't have any process in place of how these people should get involved. The people kind of resourcing aspect of these deals will inevitably get off keel, and vice versa as well. If we don't have people bought into the process, if we don't have alignment around that process and how expectations will come along, which I'll share a little bit more later, I really see that as being a huge symptom around not really having that full alignment of people as well. So I really think it's not either or, but rather how do you really pair the two? And certainly, not enough companies really take a step back and think through this problem holistically, but rather try to solve for the pain right now rather than what the real symptom really is.
I love that. I love that holistic idea, especially when you're an athlete. That's such a good metaphor. I wanted to ask, what are some best practices that you see for really running a succinct process? So you've given us so many examples, but if people had to walk away and say, all right, I'm going to take away this one thing or these 3 things to get my process ready, what would you give them?
Yeah, I think just making sure that you're thinking through what actually is happening in the process. I know that sounds very simple, but I think oftentimes a lot of this isn't documented. And I think a huge portion of that, and the reason why, is because people aren't really thinking through what really has to happen in this process to get this across the line, what key milestones need to come into play, what key action items need to come into play, and what do we typically see maybe in different segments, breaking this out by potentially mid-market or enterprise, or figuring out maybe based upon the product line we're selling or the use case. There's plenty of ways of, slicing and dicing this information. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of times the execution of it isn't documented and fairly ad hoc. And it doesn't really allow for other teams to really understand what's going on, as well as also really help other teams to ramp up on the process. So I really think running a succinct process, for one, is kind of navigating what actually needs to be involved in that process for one. I think also too, being explicit. I think oftentimes, vendors oftentimes are very kind of a little bit afraid of being really explicit with the buyer of, what is the goal here? Why are we spending our time here? And how long should we be spending here to make sure that we do get to that eventual successful deal or successful POC, successful validation event that we are trying to hit on right now. But unfortunately, I think without having that documentation of understanding of what needs to happen during this process, it really doesn't allow you to have that kind of explicit sense of how can I share with the buyer of really what we're going toward here, and really ensuring that we are kind of running that succinct process. And when I think of explicit, that could be timing, like, hey, this is the duration of the POC we're running. This is the key milestones we'll be running and how long those should be taking. Just making sure that keeping everyone in track externally, let alone internally, right, is based upon, maybe reps and SEs working together, reps and potentially like proposal management working together, ensuring that throughout the process, each individual can be really aligned around that explicit kind of timeline there.
Awesome. Alignment, that's a big word, right? That's always a big word. All right, I think that you've given a ton of information and foundations on what we need to see. I would love to know some horror stories. If we want to move on to the second piece, I really want to know how you see things fall apart. And it seems kind of obvious where we're talking about alignment, and now we're going to talk about misalignment, but maybe people aren't seeing what you're seeing. So I'd love to hear some stories.
Yeah, and exactly what you said is like people aren't seeing what I'm seeing, or people aren't seeing sometimes what the ICs are seeing. I think oftentimes it goes far beyond what Salesforce does. It goes into the actual execution collaboration of the deal. And I think oftentimes, the information that management or leadership sees is kind of the tip of the iceberg. And there's a lot of kind of potential chaos and other things that kind of go on within that, unfortunately, you don't learn about until far later when the deal's ready to go and you're a little bit delayed on it. So yeah, I think definitely misalignment of teams is a huge portion. And I think honestly, the horror stories around this is just that people will have different team members or individuals kind of running through very large multi-million-dollar deals and running very different process sets when they're executing. Now, certainly there's like high-level sales stages that you can certainly run that are great for, completing negotiation or completing a POC. But within that POC, within that negotiation or within that proposal management, what else is happening? And making sure each individual line there is pretty massive. What we found is actually oftentimes with the deliverables or each deliverable that happens in, like, let's say a POC or proposal management process, there's oftentimes, if you think of a sales stage, you might have about like 20 different deliverables that might happen within that sales stage or more. That's like even maybe a minimum. And so what we found sometimes is that each deliverable will take way longer than expected, maybe 2 days to a week. So as you start to add that up and start to add up the lag time there, that's where we find that oftentimes a lot of leadership is realizing by the end of the quarter, oh, wow, I didn't realize this bottleneck that was cropping up until I actually had to dig in with my rep. I had to dig in with my SE. I had to dig in with all these different people. But unfortunately, what we find is they just have no idea, because you have no idea as to what's going on into that actual execution portion of it. That typically, again, is in like Slack channels and plenty of other places where this deal context can really be lost throughout. So that's a huge portion, I think, of like people not really putting the importance of execution. I think in the deal process, I think when you think of like the hybrid world today, there's a ton to get done. And I think we've even seen it ourselves is within kind of this hybrid world, having this operationalization of the process and really understanding how do I succinctly share information with people is becoming much more important. But unfortunately, I think a lot of people right now are just figuring it out, because obviously hybrid work is brand new in the past like couple years from a peer perspective of like majority of people doing it. So that's certainly, I think, a big horror story is like the addition of like deliverables throughout this process, and inevitably the breakdown of like quotas not being hit. Additionally, like the deals going far beyond that month or quarterly goal, and then potentially losing out on those. What I mentioned on the status quo piece of like the status quo maybe being really strong, the competitor you're going up against is really strong. if you don't have alignment of your teams on these deliverables, the slowdown internally can inevitably allow you to lose that deal because you're not able to get to that buyer or customer as quickly as possible. You're not able to inevitably make sure you're providing that good experience. And then also you're not able to hit the other milestones that you're shooting for down that line of the overall deal as well. So that's like one top, horror story that happens honestly too often to count with a lot of these companies, especially as you can imagine when they're scaling so fast. It's something where they do have to take that holistic step back, like we said before, as well. But that's, I think, a brief example of that as well.
I like that. You kind of scared me into aligning myself. It's like you're losing out so much and we're climbing that mountain together and you're just falling behind. Amazing. Did you want to talk about more of the processes to look out for? And a question that I had for you was, it seems like you're always kind of evaluating your processes. And I think a lot of people aren't on the same page as you are. How often are you like constantly looking at the way things are run? Because I thought of this when you said that it's not until the very end where people are seeing all of these bottlenecks, right? What tips do you have for people to stay on the lookout?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think it's something we even do internally at Prelay, beyond just deals or anything. We're always trying to internalize, are we running this process the best way possible? Because I think in the end, if you're putting any time into process, if you're putting any time to thinking through how do we run something efficiently and effectively, you need to be circling back on that, right? I think oftentimes people will, maybe implement a sales methodology. I'm sure this will speak to lots of people. Implement like a sales methodology or plenty of other kind of process sets where kind of implement it, let it sit there, leave it, and then wait for the other leader to kind of change it potentially later on. And I think that is like an inherent problem within sales in general is how do we really think through the way that we can consistently be iterating rather than kind of starting and then removing. How do we start to iterate on things that are working and things that are not? And I think that goes back to really keeping consistent and really making sure that we are checking in on how things are going. Because I think a really big thing of sales, and I think this is why it happens often, is everyone wants to just be growing, right? Everyone wants to be closing their deals. Everyone wants to be making sure they're gathering revenue and hitting their goals. But when you take a step back, you really think through the way to hit our goals in the best way possible, the way to ensure that we hit our revenue isn't necessarily just to go like brute force, like straight into the wall. It's how do we actually, think through the process that will get us there easily, will get us there effectively, and also make sure that we check in on those and see things that are working or see things that are not necessarily. So that certainly, I think, is a huge portion here. And I think when you think about that execution, pairing that with enablement, pairing that with people and making sure that you're really supporting that deal is a huge portion of that consistency that needs to be kind of thought through.
Love that. Amazing. All right. I want to talk through some universal fixes for these problems. If you're ready to talk about that.
Yeah, for sure. I think lastly, like one thing just to note here on kind of mentioned some of the horror stories as well. I think there's a huge piece around like misalignment of teams and like overall like lack of like process and making sure that you are tracking beyond those sales stages. But I think there is one thing around just like ensuring that your team is able to get deal context. I think what we find time and time again is like these kind of horror stories around not being able to even gather what's happening on the deal. Like you're trying to figure out, but it's kind of in direct messages. It's in potentially kind of not shared files. It's in files that are kind of in random places. And so the horror story there typically is that it's just, you can't get a hold of it when the time is right of like the context, what we should be moving toward and what's happened already, where we find oftentimes that transparency is super important. Is how do you start to provide more transparency? I think it goes back to like the hybrid piece I was mentioning a little bit earlier, is like how do we ensure that within a hybrid world, we kind of have to be a little bit more transparent to ensure that everyone's aligned, ensure that we can't stop at someone's desk or anything pretty easily there. So that's really a huge portion of ensuring that you can have that deal context in one place is how do you ensure that you can get a hold of that? And that's a lot of that is through transparency of documentation, transparency of process sets, transparency of who's working on what, kind of across the board too.
Transparency is part of your alignment. I remember thinking when we were doing some lightning talks recently on data-driven management, and I was curious about how you get your team to be on board with that's one of your core values, right? Like constantly thinking about data, and you're constantly kind of pushing your team to have this holistic view to really understand the value of your product. What kind of ways do you instill that into your team? Is it something that you're talking about in your one-on-one? Do you have a little mantra? How do you do that?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's all about going back to OKRs and clear values that you could be setting for your team. I think it goes back to just the day-to-day and how you run your workflows. For us, we're with our meetings, we're always looping back to the goals we're shooting for the week, for the month, for the quarter. We're always tracking towards something. And inevitably to track towards something, we also need to be collaborative internally, which means we also need to be really aligned around how we're tracking toward that. What's the process around this? How are we making sure we're getting there? And I think inevitably that's how do you fit this within your workflows as a team? So that's one, those meetings, OKRs, really ensuring that KPIs are tied to that as well. And I think obviously aligning goals around these process sets is going to be a really important piece of that. Because once people start to realize how impactful running a really thoughtful process, ensuring that you're aligned with team members as well is to hitting goals, and a lot of that can be a massive amount of revenue. That's where they start to really have that clear buy-in. But I think it's really important to tie it to clear goals, because otherwise it's just kind of a side project, right? It's not something that is inherently going to be prioritized day in and day out as well.
Awesome. Beautiful. You've got your clear goals. We're aligned. We're transparent. We're ready to go. Let's hop into these universal fixes then, because I think you've already dropped some knowledge, but I feel like here's where it's all going to come together.
Yeah, for sure. So I kind of already mentioned this, I guess, just a second ago, is how do you really think about hitting these goals with the team involved and things that need to get done inherently? Because in the end, it's certainly a rep could force through different steps in the process, but oftentimes they need to tag along their team members throughout to make sure that these different deliverables can be done thoughtfully and with their expertise and specialty. So really, I think the biggest portion is not just aligning of individuals, but rather how do you align these teams throughout of clear expectations, clear responsibilities throughout the process. I actually did a talk with you all a little bit ago around, I think it was pre-sales and sales alignment is one of our core use cases. We have some others too, but how do you align the sales reps along with pre-sales? How do you align the sales reps along with proposal managers or potentially deal desk or anyone else that might get involved? A lot of that ties back to really thinking through that process and mapping out those responsibilities and expectations. I think that without that, especially if you're at a large enterprise company and then you're also trying to sell to another, it starts to become very cumbersome for the rep to figure out who should I get a hold of, what are their responsibilities, when should I be reaching out to them, and then likewise on the other end, how should I be spending my time? When should I be hopping into deals? What else should I be working on? And I think a lot of that then starts to compound into this kind of overall process of how do we ensure throughout everyone has their clear ownership and accountability throughout? Because I think that's a huge portion of this is honestly ownership and accountability. I think oftentimes there's a lot of people that when we think about goals and goal setting and tying that back to the clear individual driven goal of closing up a deal, sales reps obviously have a very clear, decisive goal around it because they have commission, they have quotas to hit, and it drives them to obviously get to that point in some ways. But there's a lot of people that get involved beyond that that certainly don't have as much of that incentive to get to that point. So how do you make sure you have that accountability, those responsibilities outlined of really how they should be getting involved in the process and how they can be the most helpful and impactful for the team and honestly the deal. And obviously these deals are super important for companies. The revenue team is the one that drives a lot of these companies to IPO, right? So in the end, making sure these people are accountable and really understand their responsibilities is a huge portion of this. And this spans beyond just the sales team, it's product. How do they get involved? Maybe engineering could be pinged throughout the process. Potentially could be legal, right? So there's a lot of people that aren't inherently gathering a commission or a quota per se, but certainly are having to get involved and need to understand their responsibilities. I think beyond that, I kind of mentioned some of the pieces around the validation points, and we view those validation points as the most important in these deals. Is if you can't cross a POC thoughtfully, if you can't be crossing like a trial and converting that, you can't get across like security. These are all things that are inherently are going to block you from getting that deal done. And so really thinking through how do you map out a process and pair people with that is a huge portion of this. So how do you take in what your team's doing already? So I kind of mentioned that is like, how do we start to dig into maybe those docs and sheets they're pulling together to date? Or how do we start to dig into like maybe the presentation decks we're pulling together and running a process around and really understanding how we can best facilitate this across the board? Because what we find is just, it's if you're not trying to run discovery around the process, you're never going to be able to really understand what's going to be the most useful to run on that end. But I think a huge portion here, and this is like, I think something that people oftentimes think through at the very beginning of a deal and maybe the very end, but not really in the middle. When you think about a deal and a customer you're selling to, especially as I mentioned earlier, an enterprise customer, that value that they look for is the most important thing to be proving out. And unfortunately, what we find is that you confirm this value, get these business drivers or objectives from them, maybe define some success criteria in the very beginning, and you're like, hey, I'm ready to go close up this deal. What we find is oftentimes when those teams that have to hop in, maybe solutions consulting, have to do a POC to prove out the product's enough. Maybe we have, deal desk figuring out some sort of negotiation pieces. Unfortunately, what we find there is the value is lost. It's not reinforced to the buyer of why they're spending the time elsewhere. It's not reinforced internally as to what are we actually driving to here. So that's another piece that we always really try to ensure teams do is how do you start to align the value in every process you're running throughout the deal? Because you do want to be reminding the buyer and the team why we're even spending time here. And also, obviously, spending time here in the sense of making sure you all are successful in becoming a customer in the very end.
I bolded and starred align the value in every process you're running. I think that's the perfect sentence to everything you've been talking about, right? That holistic piece, making sure people are on the same page. And you're reminding me, I want to move on to the next one, if that's okay with you, where we just had our summit last week, and it feels way longer than last week. But we talked about people and processing technology, and it seems like you've really honed this process and of people. But I want to kind of dig into any red flags that you might see, any problems that you identify that are really essential before you start adding all that technology in. So what kind of things are you seeing that you need to fix before it breaks, really?
Yeah, and I've kind of alluded to some of these, but to be explicit on like what those red flags are in a sense is one is exactly what we do internally at Prelay, and then also what we find a lot of top companies do that are able to run a really great process is really making sure there's really clear OKRs and KPIs around supporting the deal of other team members that are hopping in. What we find otherwise, then they're kind of just working in their silo, just trying to get work done day in, day out, and not being inherently collaborative, not trying to be as helpful as possible, and inevitably kind of being pretty disconnected from the actual process that's being run. So when we talk about that value, it tends to get lost during that point in time where that other person might be helping in. So I think that's one core piece, is like when the OKRs and alignment aren't necessarily aligned to the greater goal of the company and the revenue driver. I think also just being able to identify those bottlenecks that are happening in the process. I think right now, as mentioned, it's really hard to, like, being able to dive into sheets and different docs. It's kind of hard to understand what has been blocked in the process. But obviously, like with Prelay, that's a lot of what we provide, is like the understanding of kind of overall bottlenecks that do come up in that process. But if you can figure out ways of navigating those or like identifying those, I think what we find there typically is there's actually massive bottlenecks in that kind of execution portion, where typically it's not documented anywhere, where that's where I would really narrow into for maybe those OKRs, maybe for understanding how those stakeholders should be getting more involved, and really understanding how we can be driving that process a little bit more, or that part of the process more efficiently. Because that's typically where we find a lot of the delays, is like 1 to 2 key bottlenecks of different groups or key people or deliverables that are hopping into the process there. And I think other than that, like when we think of people getting involved in the process, I think oftentimes what we find, it kind of goes back to that comment I made earlier around like what's actually like the problem, or is it just like a symptom of something else? We find oftentimes is when you're looping people into the process, a lot of them might be pretty resource constrained. So they might not be able to have the capacity to help out as much and be that useful. So that's one thing, is like standing the capacity there. What we find typically is a huge red flag, actually, is that people oftentimes go hire a ton of people thinking that that will help solve the pains they're having. But inevitably, kind of going back to what I've mentioned this whole time, is they're not diagnosing the problem in the process and really diagnosing how their team can be more productive and more useful in the process, and maybe have more clear expectations, clear goals throughout the process. Unfortunately, what we find, it's just kind of like, which totally makes sense, because it's easy to, sometimes not easy, but oftentimes easy to go, hire somebody else and figure out if we can put another mind to it. But oftentimes it's taking a step back and thinking through, for one, how do we make sure our teams are as productive as possible? And how do we make sure that they really are aligned around this goal? And from my perspective, I view that as a huge portion of why you would need a system around this, is how do you ensure that throughout the process, your teams you're able to understand the capacity of the teams hopping in, for one. You're also able to make sure they're as productive as possible, as there's a lot of things that have to go on, as noted. So being able to have that kind of orchestration layer of what's actually happening in the process, really understanding what needs to happen next, and really making sure that it's easy to get a hold of any sort of resource, any sort of needs kind of throughout, and providing that great buyer experience in the end, I think is a huge portion of needing a system around this as well. So definitely, I have lots of thoughts around kind of how do people process, like really cause the need for kind of systems.
Mm-hmm.
But it certainly, there is always a balance of, do we make more hires, or do we make this process a little bit more optimized?
Yeah. And you just touched on systems, which is what I wanted to talk about next. We've kind of identified our red flags, right? We know what to look for. We've got our people in our process. And not to be corny, but those are our peanut butter and our jelly. And I think of tech as our bread. So we've either got like our Wonder Bread, it's $1 at the store. I don't know what store I'm going to where bread is $1, but we've got our dollar bread versus our artisanal bread. How does tech, or our bread, or a tech come into play for you? Like, what things are you looking for to help you really push through everything that you've already created?
For sure. Yeah, and I can definitely give some thoughts here. So on this end, what we actually typically see at Prelay is people are trying to document things, as mentioned, on doc sheets. They're trying to like map out like what the ideal process is in like a very standard like text form only. And where the limitations lie there is it's really hard to project manage that. It's also hard to tie that back to the sales process. It also doesn't really allow you to get the idea of how the team can interact with this and really get this done and put it in, kind of transform it into real life in sense. So what we find there is oftentimes that really puts it to that next level of what more can we be doing with our process? What more can we be doing with our people? And how do we make sure that this can all be paired together in real time? And I think the real time piece is a huge portion of this. When we think of the document, it's very static, right? You have maybe a one-dimensional like text fields and different things, not even text fields, it's just text in general that you can't track anywhere. You can't have any real-time updates around. So certainly getting a system will allow for those real-time updates, really allow for the team to be collaborating in real time, as well as also ensuring that there is adoption around the process, right? You asked this maybe 20 minutes ago or so, was how do we really make sure that these people are bought into the process? And I think a lot of it is understanding who's adopting, who's not, who's confused, and really starting to get like more of a grasp around that and that more of that data lens as well.
Asking what more for our process and what more for our people. We've got our sandwich people. We're ready to go. I think we should move on to our Q&A. I'm going to check the Q&A chat. I don't see anything, but I have 2 questions for you. The first one, what do you see as the biggest difference between the people and the processes that you need for enterprise, which is what we're talking about now, compared to SMB sales?
For sure. I think for us, I think in the end, it depends on if you mean like selling to the enterprise or SMB, it's going to be very different. I think if you're in enterprise or SMB or an enterprise company selling to enterprise, oftentimes it's very similar, but you're kind of playing at this like resource constraint place. So with an SMB, you might have to be a little bit more nimble and fast and able to cover more ends, versus where at like a larger enterprise, you're selling to an enterprise there, you're going to have lots more resources. You're going to be able to segment this out. You're going to be able to like pinpoint those responsibilities and expectations as noted. Now, if we take it from the lens of I'm selling to an SMB versus an enterprise, we certainly find that with an SMB, it's typically more of a straightforward sale. You definitely don't need as many people involved. From an enterprise perspective, certainly as mentioned, kind of a lot of things today, that's where a lot of the team sell will come into play and a lot of the complex processes as well.
Awesome. And then my last question that I have for you is, do you have any tips on what to look for when you're building out your enterprise sales team? I think we've kind of got this idea of the traits that we need for people, right? But what would you say is essential to look for when you're building an enterprise sales team out?
Mm-hmm. I think a couple things. I think especially when we think about like more of the operational side of things, like with hybrid work, I think that's been a huge portion, is thinking of, and this is kind of a couple things that are like outside of the box that typically people think through, is who thinks forward, who's thinking forward in the deal, who's thinking through the kind of steps in the process that needed to be taken care of, and collecting all the information up front as much as possible. Certainly that kind of discovery period is a huge portion of that, but really getting a sense on that buyer end of where things are coming and really being strategic on that end as well, of really understanding how you can be covering any sort of bottlenecks early in the process is a huge portion. I think it goes back to being proactive. We always like to think, especially with our product, as well as also our team, how can you be as proactive as possible? And I think with these enterprise deals, there's so many obstacles that can crop up, especially internally as shared, and certainly some external as well. That's where it becomes so important for enterprise reps that you're hiring to really figure out how proactive they are. How are they thinking through kind of 10 steps ahead on things? Because I think oftentimes what we find is for reps, for honestly, a lot of other roles, it's really easy to find people that will kind of take each step and just kind of go through it, versus really thinking through what's the next 10 steps and what do I need to be taking care of now so that I can get to that point. So that's like one huge portion. I think other than that, I think a huge portion, exactly what we kind of talked about today, is someone that can be able to work with other team members. I think someone that can work internally and get things done internally will be able to get a lot of these deals done much faster, because there's certainly a lot of bottlenecks and obstacles that happen internally that you have to be able to work with different audiences to deal with. So certainly that comes from a maybe more strategic lens of being able to understand complex problems. But it also comes to a lens of just like being able to understand other perspectives, trying to gather and figure out who needs to be involved internally. These are all things that I think inherently you have to be a great project manager around this information. So those are kind of like a few different traits that come to mind.
Amazing. Well, I'd like to just grab one last key takeaway from you. If we got a PB&J, what's the little side snack that you love for everyone to leave with?
Yeah, I mean, I think it again goes back to think through your process holistically, think through your people holistically. And if you're able to even pair them thoughtfully in like one process, that gets you way further along versus not thinking through it at all. So you don't have to attack everything at once. Being able to just even take a bite size of the process and figuring out how you can drive efficiency there will go a long way. And then you can work your way from there.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who attended today. I can't see all your faces, but it was great to having you here. Gabriella, thank you so much for speaking, dropping all this knowledge for us. We hope you're ready for some enterprise selling with the right people in the process and the technology. Make sure you check out Prelay. They're doing awesome things. The recordings and the key takeaways will all be on our website. I'm going to go ahead and end this webinar while the New York sirens are coming for me. Have a great rest of your day, everyone. See you soon.
Thank you. Take care.